I'll introduce our speaker today, Elizabeth Wrigley-Field. She's an associate professor at the University of Minnesota, a sociologist and demographer. She studies racial inequity and mortality in the historical and contemporary United States, specializing in finding comparisons and metrics that illuminate the human meaning of mortality disparities. She has intensively researched the COVID-19 pandemic in Minnesota, where she also co-founded an award-winning community vaccination organization, the Seward Vaccine Equity Project. She's also a media methodologist, developing models designed to clarify relationships between the micro and macro perspectives on population processes. So with that, I'll let Elizabeth take it away. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here. Thank you for having me. I am going to start this talk at an unusual place for a talk to an infectious disease epi audience, as you'll see in just a moment. But the reason I'm starting there is that it's an entry point into some questions about what we're really trying to do when we look at mortality disparities, especially the Black-white mortality disparities in the United States, which a lot of my career so far has been about. And the reason I wanted to present this is that these are actually the questions that I've felt the most uncertain about in my research life in the past few years. And so I wanted to share how I'm thinking about them and get some feedback on that. So let's go. So among the stories of violence that Margaret Burnham recounts in her book, By Hands Now Known, Jim Crow's Legal Executioners, is this series of incidents in Alabama's Union Springs in 1945. There's a stretch of Black businesses. It includes a shop and cafe owned by Edgar Bernard Thomas. And then next door to that, there's a barber shop that's owned by the Reverend James L. Pinckney. And one day, Thomas's business is visited by two police officers. One of them is interested in a woman who Thomas had been romantically linked to, and he murders Thomas. Reverend Pinckney then hears the other officer say, "We're going to run this damn town. I'll kill every Black son of a bitch in the streets." The police chief visits him later that day and warns him to get out of town. And so he does. He flees to Chicago. He never returns. The tragedies and injustices that were enacted on Thomas and Pinckney on that one day in October 1945 illustrate this core aspect of Jim Crow that comes across really clearly in this book, which is the intertwining of theft and violence. Pinckney lost his business and his home. Thomas lost his life. And so among the consequences of this widespread racial terror are this immense loss of wealth among Black Americans who'd sought to amass security through businesses and property, and also the losses of life that facilitated many of those thefts. So those linked thefts of wealth and of life are sort of these twin faces of racial domination in the United States. And they're the foundations of enslavement, right, which built extraordinary wealth through stolen labor power or life's work. And so I start there with this sort of reminder to think very broadly about not just wealth, but this theft of self-determination as this most fundamental theft of America's systems of racial domination. I start there because a few years ago, I started recircling some questions about mortality disparities when I started paying attention to one particular policy conversation, which is the conversation that really intensified a few years ago about reparations for slavery, Jim Crow, and other institutionalized forms of white supremacy. So reparations policy proposals vary tremendously in their details. Sometimes they're individual payments to particular African descendants of slaves. Other times they're community land trusts. There's a whole array of mechanisms, but nearly all of them have in common that they focus on a single target for redress, which is wealth. And wealth is seen as like the mechanism for redress, even when the goal is actually something to do with health, which is the case for the articles on this slide, with the exception of the two outlined in pink, which are exceptions to that idea that the mechanism is always about wealth. And on one level, this focus makes complete sense to me, theoretically, because there's no single greater proxy for power than wealth, right? Like nothing else gives you as much flexible power and control as wealth does. But I would argue that if wealth is the best proxy for power, then time, how much time we get, how much control we get to have over it, might be the best single proxy for freedom. And so I started wondering, thinking about these policy proposals and thinking about the work that I do in mortality, what would it look like to take seriously lost time and especially lost lifespan as a harm on equal footing with lost wealth and try to redress it? So this is not actually a policy talk, even though this is how I've started. I do have some somewhat specific, not too specific thoughts about what a reparative program focused on lost lifespans could look like, and we can talk about it as time and your interest allows. But there's kind of a logically prior question, which is, what exactly is it that we're trying to redress? If we say that, okay, like lost lifespan is equally important to lost wealth, what does that mean we're actually trying to make right? And so that brings me back to the big question of this talk, which is, what do the Black-white lifespan gaps actually reveal, and what do they disguise in our understanding? And so I want to start with this very basic question: how big is the Black-white lifespan gap? And I'll start with a very basic answer to it, which is before the pandemic, the non-Hispanic Black-white gap in life expectancy at birth was 4 years. In 2020, it was almost 6 years. 2021, 5.5. 2022, back down to 4.7, so still higher than before the pandemic, but edging more toward that. And so, okay, so that's the answer, right? Well, so the problem is, it's actually very hard to get our heads around what a lifespan gap of, let's say, like 4 years actually means, for all of the extremely familiar reasons about making sense of highly variable and skewed averages. And so to make this number more meaningful, I've come to think that there are basically 3 strategies of approaches. The first one that I call conventional approaches is you try to quantify the gap, just like we do with life expectancy at birth, but you try to just make it a little bit more meaningful by giving other kinds of summary of what's going on in the lifespan distribution. So I'll give you an example that comes from my own work in progress, which is, so this graph, and this is, I should say, from work with a wonderful recent Minnesota grad in applied economics, PhD, Quavu. And this shows the lifespan gap at different points in the lifespan distribution. So for example, if we want to look at the median, which is the bright yellow line here, the median white lifespan before the pandemic was about 4 years longer than the median Black lifespan. And so that's what you can see. So it's actually very similar to the life expectancy gap, the mean, which you wouldn't necessarily expect. You also really see here this huge gap in the first percentile. That's that dark line that really shoots up. And so what that's telling us is that back in 1980, the Black and white first percentile lifespans were equal. So the people who died the youngest died at the same age. But by the late 90s, or certainly by right before the pandemic, the white first percentile was 20 years longer than the Black first percentile. And I'll show you exactly why that happened in just a sec. At the other end of the spectrum, before the pandemic, the 90th percentiles were pretty much identical. And those only go back to 1997 because the older data were top coded too young. Okay, so we'll see what happens here. So these are just the ages of death. And you can see why that 90th percentile gap grows in the pandemic, which is that in 2020, Black lifespans are pulled down across the whole lifespan distribution. But you can also really see exactly what happened at that first percentile. So in 1980, there's no gap because 1% of Black babies and 1% of white babies don't live out their first year of life. But that rapidly changes for white babies. So the bottom percentile is now living into their 20s, while the bottom percentile of Black babies still dies in their first year or just after as 1-year-olds. This whole talk, I should say, is about really hard things, but this to me is actually the hardest statistic. And I've seen a lot of stuff about maternal mortality and so on, but I actually hadn't really taken in until we were sort of thinking about these measures that 1% of Black babies don't live beyond their first year of life. Okay, so these are fundamentally conventional approaches, though, to trying to understand the lifespan gap. And Quan and I try to do something somewhat new with them, which is that we take this measure that was discovered by the economists Bayer and Charles in a wonderful article on income distributions, and also discovered 20 years earlier by the sociologist Martina Morris and the statistician Mark Hancock, who also used it to study income distributions. But we use it to show that, like, with the exception of those infant mortality deaths that are really distinct and are not on this plot here, that essentially all of the reduction, I'll explain what this graph is in just a sec, essentially all of the reduction in that Black-white longevity gap that's happened over these decades has been driven by changes in the racial order of deaths, not sort of race neutral changes in lifespan inequality. And so what we did here is a pretty simple simulation. The red line is what you would see if the Black and white order of deaths were frozen in time. For this graph, it's at their 1997 values, which is the first year that we can see those older ages at death when they improved the top coding to older ages. So the red line is what you would see if we froze the order of deaths at the 1997 levels, but we allowed the actual ages at death to change just like they did in the population. So what that means is if in 1997, the 14th shortest lifespan was a Black person and the 15th shortest lifespan was a white person, that will still be true in the simulation, but how long those 14th and 15th shortest lifespans actually are will change, just like it actually did from 1997 into the intervening years. And the thing that you see kind of right away in this gap is that not quite all, but most of these red lines are just exceptionally flat, meaning that what's happened with the improvement in the Black-white lifespan inequality over decades has not happened because people with short lifespans just now live longer, and those people were disproportionately Black, and this sort of like somewhat race-neutral change has disproportionately benefited the Black population. That's not the story. That's what the red line would show with an increase. What has actually happened is that there's been a real improvement in the positioning of Black lifespans in relation to white ones across the board from the mid-1990s into the mid-2010s, and then mostly a kind of plateau until the pandemic. And this, by the way, is completely different from the story about what's changed in income. Okay, so this is what we try to do in this paper. You know, it's like a somewhat new approach, but it fundamentally is this very conventional approach because it's based on still thinking that if we could just find the right numbers to summarize this gap, in this useful way in our statistics, we can get some understanding of what exactly this lifespan gap means. Some of the innovation in formal demography in recent years has been in developing new conventional measures like this. So just new ways of summarizing the lifespan distributions. This is a quick table typologizing some of those new and old measures. So the left column is measures that are based on describing a single population with some metric that you can then compare across populations. And the right side is more directly comparative measures. But I put this up just to illustrate because these kinds of measures are not actually the only strategy for trying to wrest meaning out of lifespan distributions. So another one that I have used in my work is what I've taken to calling action-based approaches. And the idea of the action-based approaches is that none of us really have in our head a good, objective foundation for understanding the scale of most risks, and certainly not for how that scale should translate into any kind of action. So what we do when we encounter a new situation is we benchmark. We calibrate our sense of risk in the new situation by comparing to other risks for which we already have some established behavioral repertoire. And the idea of action-based approaches is that you can use that same kind of move to find meaningful heuristics for understanding what disparities mean. So if you've encountered my work in just one place before, it was probably in this article, where I showed that white death rates during the pandemic were unlikely to equal what Black death rates are like every year. So specifically, I found that if in order for white mortality in 2020 to reach the best ever levels that Black mortality has ever been, it would have taken 400,000 excess white deaths. And when I wrote this in the summer of 2020, that number was actually unimaginable to me. As it turned out, we did not reach that in 2020. We did reach it in 2021, the year that white death rates actually exceeded the best pre-pandemic Black death rates. But the force of this comparison to me is that we did so much to try to stop pandemic deaths. We as individuals and also as major institutions that we're part of, like our universities, really transformed themselves in ways we would not have previously thought possible in order to try to limit those deaths. And there are other comparisons you could make like this. So for example, if you eliminated the age-adjusted Black-white mortality gap, it would be like, in terms of the number of lives saved, it would be like eliminating more than 80% of the Black cancer deaths, right? And so that's an action-based metric to the extent that it leads you to think about what are the things we try to do to stop those cancer deaths, and what would it look like to take a similar scale of action to attack them as a racial inequity. But the other kind of approach, the third strategy here, is something very different, which is to try to spell out what lost lifespan means in human terms. And the idea is that losing time in the form of an untimely death is a really distinctive harm, because the meanings that we make of our lives unfold in time. So that means that death entails the loss of connections, which are losses that reverberate for others. It means losing the chance to see ourselves and our loved ones at different stages in life, to let our ideas unfurl in time, to develop the synthesis of wisdom, right? Like, because we're social creatures that age so well, and creatures that, that learn so well, aging gives us different kinds of perspectives on the world, right? So I think it's not just sort of a cliche to talk about aging bringing about the possibility of wisdom. It's actually something very deep about the kinds of organisms that we are. And untimely death also means the loss of our effects on the world and our personal projects. So cutting all these losses short is also this huge cultural loss. And I will just acknowledge that I always feel a little bit ambivalent about describing it that way, because I never want to detract from the fact that the person whose life is lost is like the most profound loss is always to them. But I also think it can be helpful to just sort of name the full harm, which is that early deaths are robbing all of us of the effects that those people who died should have had on the world. So the things that make our lives meaningful really get their meaning from how they extend over our lives and our loved ones' lives. Cutting someone's life short robs them of that meaning. And so, you could imagine a different kind of research agenda on the sides of this lifespan gap as the one that is sort of implicit in or could be built from all those sort of things that I just flashed on the screen in the last few slides. So counting up the lost votes and the lost cultural legends and lost familial ties and lost chances at reconciliation or redemption. So I haven't actually done much of this in my own empirical work yet, but some of the work that I'm actually just starting is thinking about demography as a way of like constraining or enabling political movements through the way that our kinship structures can link us to the experiences of political events. So like a very simple example is how much memory of the civil rights movement was lost in the COVID pandemic because of the way that older African Americans were so disproportionately likely to die. That is, among other ways, a way of quantifying these particular types of losses of early death. Okay, so this is my sort of quick tour through strategies of thinking about what do we learn from mortality disparities in a more concrete way than just saying, like, this is what the lifespan gap is. So the other side of the question, though, is what don't we learn? And I think I'll do this part more quickly so we have lots of time to talk, because that's always my favorite part. But when we analyze lifespans, we're often forced to use something like a disparity for a really simple reason, which is that lifespans don't have a natural baseline. So the only way we actually know what's a long or short lifespan is to build in some kind of comparison. And the reason why, well, one reason why that's so problematic is that it normalizes other lifespans, which are themselves a really distinctly racialized experience. And that's true almost no matter what the comparison is, if it's Black or white lifespans in the United States today, comparing Black lifespans across states or counties with different histories of enslavement. And I think a good way to understand this limitation of our conceptual resources for thinking about lifespans is to think about an analytical move that some of the literature on wealth reparations makes that's not so available to us if we want to think about redress for lifespans. And that move is to go piece by piece, right? So in this is an example by Trevon Logan and Bill Darity, two economists, and the move they make is they try to glimpse the scale of the whole by taking just a tiny bit at a time. And so they look at this one pivotal moment, which is a massacre of Black farmers in Arkansas in 1919, and they ask how much wealth was stolen just through this one injustice. And they come up with this answer, which is more than $10 million. But the key point to me is that when they undertake this strategy of saying, okay, we're just going to look at this one massacre in Arkansas in 1919, they are not building in any assumption that, for example, the Tulsa riot 2 years later doesn't matter. They're just saying we're going to start in a tractable way by looking at one piece. And it would be great if comparing, let's say, white versus Black lifespans, or what Black lifespans in northern versus southern states, or something like that, provided a similarly revealing, if imperfect, starting points. But because we talk about lifespans comparatively, because we conceptualize them as a disparity, because we don't know how else to do it, we build in the assumption that the lifespans we're comparing to were not limited by America's history of enslavement and racial terror in the same way. And that assumption, of course, is very questionable and has been very directly and forcefully challenged. And to me, the most uncomfortable way for me to conceptualize this problem is to think about it like this. There's a demography 101 lesson that I try to hammer home to my students all the time, which is as you structure your measures, when you're thinking about how to set up your research problems, do whatever you can possibly do to have all the action be in the numerator, not the denominator, because then it'll be something that we know how to think about. Our intuitions for how to compare things will work right. Put the action in the numerator. It is very uneasy to be someone who pushes for that sort of rule of thumb in almost every other context, but also has built a career around studying racial disparities in mortality, which I'm sort of arguing flagrantly violates that prescription. And so that's the uncomfortable position that I'm in, that I don't really know how to think my way out of, which is why I'm giving this talk about the problems that I don't know how to think my way out of. So as an example, my own work, recent work shows that since the pandemic, aggregate racial disparities have pretty much returned to exactly what they were pre-pandemic, but mortality has really decisively shifted in other ways, including especially this really kind of hard shift to rural areas. And there's a few other shifts that we could talk about more in Q&A if we want, but we often mistakenly assume that rural mortality means white mortality. That's actually not true. Some of my own pandemic mortality work is about how bad the COVID mortality crises were for people of color in rural areas. But in this case, there is this sort of move to white rural regions being places of intensifying mortality. And I think a question that all of us who take disparities as evidence of racism should ask ourselves is, if the crisis of mortality for white Americans became dramatically worse and therefore racial disparities fell further, what would we conclude? And our answer should shape what we do with disparities now. And indeed, I'm not going to really talk through this graph, so you can think about this as just a sort of like perplexing wallpaper for this point. But a couple of years ago, when prominent commentators like David Leonhardt, the New York Times columnist who writes the morning column, were celebrating the fact that racial disparities declined very dramatically from the pandemic's first year to its second year. So David Leonhardt called this Biden's biggest success story. And my collaborators and I argued in this article that a better understanding of what changed in the pandemic's second year is that white COVID mortality became much worse. So yes, the disparities declined, but it's hard to see that as a public health success because it's actually about the quote baseline mortality getting worse. And so this is, sort of that fundamental problem of conceptualizing what we're trying to make right in terms of a disparity. It seems like it's actually really missing something in situations like this. So, I mean, white mortality gets used as a baseline largely because something needs to. There might be other baselines that could be better. This is from a recent paper by Jacob Bohr and colleagues, which actually I had nothing to do with. I'm just a fan of it. But one of the things they do is compare racial groups in the United States to the rest of the world. So the solid line at 1 here is an average mortality in a set of wealthy countries. And the other lines are the United States in total in the bottom right, or for other specific racial groups, right? And so, when you compare Black, for example, mortality to US white mortality, you don't fully see how many lives are cut short from this perspective that asks, what if the United States looked like other countries? Okay, so that, moves like that maybe would be a better one for people like me who are becoming concerned about what do we disguise when we think so much about disparities in the United States. So let's see, how am I on time? I'm okay. I'm gonna maybe do one more thing quickly and then get to questions, which is I'll just give some examples of what might it look like to try to have a real redress for lost lifespans. So I'll just give some examples that are along 2 dimensions. One dimension is, do they try to equalize lifespans, or are they redressing shorter lifespans by trying to return control over time to people in some other domain besides lifespan? And the other dimension is, are they programs or policies that are really targeted to African descendants of slavery, or are they universalist policies that we have good reason to think would disproportionately address harms enacted on Black people as expressed through their lifespans? So I will fill in one cell as an example to help us think about these questions, which is, what about a mass program of expanding the Black medical workforce? So there's a lot of evidence that Black doctors can make a huge health difference for Black patients. And my personal favorite study in this vein is this one by Marcy Olson and colleagues. And this is a really unique field experiment based on an Oakland clinic that randomly assigned doctors of different races to Black male patients. And they analyzed the doctors' notes after they treated patients, and they found that Black doctors had higher quality interactions with their Black patients than white doctors did. They understood their health struggles more holistically in the context of their life circumstances. It was a really cool study. But most strikingly, what they found results about patients' willingness to embrace preventive measures, that if they scaled those results up to the population, they argue that it suggests that having enough Black doctors could reduce men's Black-white gap in cardiovascular mortality by 19%. I mean, and like that's an incredible intervention. That's a huge gap to remove. But notice that the context in which Black doctors make such a significant difference in this study is a context in which Black men suffer so many risk factors for cardiovascular disease, right? Because if people are in fundamentally good circumstances, then most people don't need a doctor most of the time. You know, that's not true for everybody, but that's kind of true in general. So in a context that successfully addressed non-medical sources of disproportionate disease burden, Black doctors would have fewer lives to save. And I mention this because it's a very general point about how to think about interventions, which is that the scale that's needed is a scale where sort of necessity, evidence will be limited and out of the ordinary. So, okay, so I'll just fill in some other cells for our thinking. A targeted version of returning time to people while they're alive could be something like a paid sabbatical program. And a final option I want to highlight is participatory. So for example, if there were a reparations program designed to return wealth to people, to individuals, then you could also imagine having a separate fund for those same eligible individuals to regain their time through some kind of collaborative process of deciding what would actually do the most to return my time to me. You could also see some real weaknesses of a program like that, including that there's a real irony in inviting people who've had time taken from them to enter into an incredibly time-intensive process to get something back, right? But, you know, on the other hand, participatory programs respect the fact that no one knows what would redress a harm better than the people being harmed. So I'll conclude with this thought. In the victim compensation for 9/11, lawyers were surprised that many families were very reluctant to accept an extremely large cash payment that also restricted their right to sue. And their assumption was that families believed that they could get larger payouts through a jury trial, and that they underestimated how painful going through a jury trial would be. But qualitative work that actually talked to those families and asked them why they were so reluctant found something different. Families were reluctant to sign away their right to sue because they actually wanted a lot of other things besides cash. They wanted acknowledgement, they wanted political reforms that would reduce the chance of what they had experienced happening to someone else. And to me, this work should remind us of a core lesson that when we're thinking about harm and redress, we should conceive of it broadly. People who are being harmed might conceive of redress in all kinds of ways. And so we should have some imagination and ambition in thinking about what does it mean to solve and redress shortened lives. And I think a good first step is to think critically about our measurement, so that what we measure, so that what we're trying to measure is what we think actually matters about the disparities we encounter. So that's where I've been left as someone studying disparities, and I'm so curious for your thoughts. Thank you. Oops.
Thank you, Dr. Thank you, Dr. Wrigley-Field, for your talk looking at the racial disparity in mortality from some new perspectives. So yeah, I'd like to open up the floor for any questions in person or on Zoom. Let's see. Oh, then can you hear me, Dr. Wrigley-Field? Can you hear me? Oh, she doesn't, seems to be. Um, can two people here? Oh, yeah, okay. Oh, okay. So yeah, we have a question. Please go ahead and unmute and ask the question, please.
Are you asking me
Oh,
online?
yes.
It's hard to hear you. So that's very provocative, provocative talk. I was intrigued by your statement about the action being in the numerator, with which I agree with, because very often a rate or a comparative rate disguises the magnitude of the problem. And certainly doing extensive risk adjustment in which you don't look at the specific groups involved is even worse. That said, sometimes the looking at the numerator can be misleading. So if you look, for example, at one of the most egregious disparities in inequities in the United States compared to other countries or even internally, the Black-white difference in maternal mortality is striking. Never mind, by the way, that white women in the United States have a worse outcome than almost anywhere else in the world as well. So, but if you look at the numbers, somebody might say, that's not a lot of deaths. Actually, the numerator is relatively small. And when I saw that, I said, wow, I mean, every death matters, and this is a terrible tragedy, and given the number of births, but it's a relatively small number. But what it entrains is all the other complications and suffering and disrespect and moral injury that Black mothers experience both during delivery and before and after delivery. So could you just comment on that? How do you encourage your students to say, well, okay, that may look small, but what is the family of measures you really ought to be looking at to truly understand it?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for that. And I think that the answer that you gave about mortality as a leading edge of a series of other harms, I think is a good answer. You could certainly make the same move in what I was sharing about lifespans from the theoretical perspective of, like, if control over our time is the thing that maybe we care the most about fundamentally, or the thing that enables all the other things that we care the most about. Lost lifespan is the sort of bleeding edge of a whole series of other processes where people lose time through segregation and jobs being located far from segregated neighborhoods, and they lose time, certainly to incarceration for people who experience that or whose loved ones do, through administrative burdens, through all these other things. So I think that's right, that one way to think about this is like the deaths are the extreme of a whole spectrum of experiences that violate people's dignity. And then I think the other part is also what you said, which is just the every life matters response, right? And that it is it's especially galling because they feel so preventable.
We have a question for Mark.
So, sorry, I don't have a better answer than repeating your answers back to you.
Somebody needs to mute. I'm not sure who it is. Thanks, Elizabeth, for that talk. I have a clarifying question and then a very naive question. The clarifying question is, you said the thing about being uncomfortable using disparities when you advise people to use the numerator only. I'm not sure I really understand exactly what the contrast is that you're describing. So I wonder if you could just be a bit more explicit. And then the simple question is, one alternative to looking at disparities is just to look at changes over time stratified by the groups that would be the comparators in the disparity, which seems like it solves some of the problems. So it's absolute changes relative to previous, which of course leaves previous as the baseline, but at least it really.
Yeah, okay, so let me take those one by one. So the clarifying question, so the advice that I give is make sure that as much as you can, make sure that the thing that is interesting is in the numerator and not the denominator. So the thing that's changing, for example, so like, for example, one of the things that happened in the pandemic is big regional shifts in where mortality was concentrated that have persisted. Mortality has stayed higher in the South and in the West, and lower in the Northeast than it was before the pandemic. And to the extent that people want to examine those with regional ratios, I think it is conceptually much clearer if you can try to find a baseline for the comparator that's just not changing very much, which actually is hard to do in the regional case, right? Because like it's first the Northeast and then it's like everywhere was hit at a certain point. So that's the advice, which I feel like is kind of like very basic. And the reason why it makes me uncomfortable about disparities is that we're sort of necessarily building in the white experience as a baseline, when it seems to me like actually there should be a lot of substantive questions about the relationship of white mortality to the same problems that we're trying to describe. So, for example, about the relationship of white mortality to racism, which is quite contested, and that it's hard to have clarity on those questions when the way that we're building in the measurement sort of takes for granted that white mortality is kind of neutral. So your proposal as an alternative to build in the past as a baseline, I think could be illuminating for some things, but also, it normalizes the disparities of the past, right? And so in a way, this is kind of what we're doing when we do those graphs that I showed, where you say like, well, let's just freeze the order that deaths happened in 1997 or 1980, and look at what's happened since then and compare the lifespan gap that we have now compared to this counterfactual. But from the perspective of seeking justice, I think that should be quite unsatisfying to us, because it can be the case that the lifespan disparity has gotten a lot smaller. That is the case, but also be the case that 1% of Black babies don't live out their first year of life, and the bottom percentile of white lifespans is into their 20s, and so that gap is what you would lose, right? So.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wrigley-Field. Please join me in thanking Dr. Wrigley-Field again for her great talk and Q&A.